So effective conversations, they anticipate the needs of the other person and meet them without you having to really push for it.
My name's Katrina.
And I'm Steve.
And we are curious about how changing conversations can change organizations.
Yeah, and together with our community of transformation nerds, we're exploring how to leverage conversations to make our workplaces more fit for humans, but also more fit for the future.
We'll use our podcast series to do just that, while being in conversation with business and thought leaders who have interesting perspectives on the topic.
So, without further ado, let's start the conversation.
Elizabeth is a professor of social interaction at Loughborough University in the UK. She conducts conversation analytic research to understand how talk works, from first dates to medical communication and from sales encounters to hostage negotiation. In addition to academic publishing, she is passionate about science communication and has given talks at TED, New Scientist, Google, Microsoft, and the Royal Institution. Her book, Talk, The Science of Conversation, was published by Little Brown in 2018, and she has co-authored a book, Crisis Talk, coming out later this year. She is a Wired Innovation Fellow and in 2021 was awarded Honorary Fellowship of the British Psychological Society. Welcome, Liz. Before sort of going into the nitty-gritty of it, what is one of the most surprising things that you have learned or found in studying conversations?
I think the most surprising thing that I've learned is that every word really does matter, and that every word could always have been something else. And trying to get your head around that enough that you could change a word, it's a bit mind-blowing, actually. You know, when I've been transcribing or analysing for a long time, you start to see your own words coming out like transcript, and the idea that you could change any one of them at any time. Yeah, it's everything. Yeah, we don't pay enough attention to it.
So are you saying that a conversation can be fundamentally changed just by changing one word?
It can, and some of my research and research of other conversation analysts has shown this, which is radical, really.
What is the biggest challenge for us as humans in conversations? And I'm thinking specifically in a corporate world, in a business world, organizational world. So what's the biggest challenge for us in regards to being in conversation?
I think it's to take less space yourself and actually enable other people to take turns. It's one of the things that I'm really passionate about, have become more and more so over the years, is to bust myths around communication, think about what communication skills really means, because we all talk about communication skills, but what does it mean? And it tends to get unpacked in quite almost stereotypical ways, rapport, listening, active listening, effective silences, and all of those things sound right, but we never really dig into them. And the job of the conversation analyst is to dig into what those things actually mean. So I think the biggest challenge is for people to really listen, and really listen. Not just listen in a of course I listen kind of way. And so one of the things I quite like to do is get people to transcribe a little bit of talk in the kind of slow motion way that we do it, and try to understand what it would really mean to listen.
One of the things that we picked up in another conversation we had is that there's a difference between listening to and listening with, and that listening can be a very intimate act. So could you put your words to what is it? Could you open that space up for us?
Yeah, for a conversation analyst, it would be about listening for action, for what people are doing. And I don't really mean sort of hidden meanings. There is so much said about communication. And the fact is that all of us have been communicating since we were born. So we have our lifetime's experience of what it takes to communicate. So what that can sometimes do is provide so much anecdata about how conversation works, that it's quite difficult to cut through that noise to the actualities, which again is what a conversation analyst does. And so when you see people actually talking, it can look quite different to how you imagine it, or how you remember it, or how, if asked, you would report on it later. So the listening thing, I sometimes reluctantly say listening is very important, because it sounds so trite. It's what everyone would say. So we can listen and know what it is that someone is doing really, really quickly. And sometimes supporting what someone is doing, or knowing where they're going with whatever it is that they're saying, means that you can respond within, fractions, tiny milliseconds, because that's how talk works. So you can see an invitation coming before it's finished, and that means you can come in really quickly to accept it. That also means that we start to see structural things about interaction that show us that the fact that you can see an invitation coming before it's finished and respond to it very quickly tells us something about why any kind of delay is indicative of some other type of response that's likely to happen next. So we're actually very adept as human beings of listening to what people are saying, so that we can respond with that precision timing. So, but of course, people are doing things all the time that require a listening in a different sort of way. And so maybe a really good example of this, which is one of my current favourite examples because it's so powerful, is listening to a 911 emergency telephone call from a woman who turns out to be a victim of domestic violence. And one of the jobs that police, emergency contact centre, one of the jobs that they have to do is to sift out the calls that are genuine and the ones that are a nuisance call in some way. So this is very interesting, first of all, because just because you call the police doesn't mean that the context means that everything you say will be taken as police relevant. One of the main jobs is to sift out the genuine from the nuisance, or not nuisance, but just, calls that don't really belong in that environment. So in this call, the woman says, "I'd like to order a pizza for delivery." So we're not looking for hidden meanings here, although there kind of is a hidden meaning, but really what you're looking to see is what is it in the way she says that, and very precisely where she says that in response to the call center person sort of asking, what's happening, that he manages to hear that as a genuine request. Because when you compare that to nuisance calls, people phone and ask for all sorts of things to the police that aren't a genuine request. So how do you figure that out? And that's what I really mean by listening. Somehow it's not just about the words. It's not just the rather basic observation that people say things that aren't literal. So you have to think about what pragmatically they mean. It's also about, because it turned out that the kind of main clue here was where it was in the sequence of turns and in overlap that the woman did that you got to see that this was a genuine request for help. And sorry, I think there's something magical about that.
Can I train my ability to sense these things on the go in a conversation and use them, those cues?
Yeah, so I turn a lot of my research findings into training for practitioners. And one of the sort of foundations of that work that I do is to show people that I'm not telling you what to say as a goal of the training. What I'm doing is showing you what you, or people like you, as experts, as experienced practitioners, as negotiators, doctors, salespeople, whatever it is that I'm looking at, this is what you're doing that is effective. And I know that you don't know that in a meta way, in a report it later way, because it's not in your training guidance for the organization. And I also know that you don't know that kind of in theory, because it's not the first thing that you always do. So again, a really nice example of this is I did some work with a colleague, Ryan Sickverland, who and we looked at crisis negotiation, so police negotiators talking to people in suicidal crisis. And one of the things that we found in there was that when negotiators ask to talk to the person in crisis or suggest talking, it gets resisted immediately by the person in crisis. I don't want to talk. What's the point in talking? Talking doesn't do anything. Whereas when the negotiators propose that we speak to each other, the person in crisis doesn't resist that in the same way, and you tend to get further, faster in the negotiation. And we know that because we see it in the evidence of the negotiations themselves. And what we sometimes see is that the negotiator will start with talk, get resistance, and then find their way to speak, because they have to keep trying. They don't have an option to end the conversation. They have to keep going. So sometimes we see practice that is effective straight away. Sometimes we see that practitioners themselves are feeling their way through that interaction to the thing that is effective. And our job as analysts is then to pull out that thing and say, hey, here's this thing that you did after 30 minutes that if you'd done it at the start would have been more effective. And then that can lead to two things with regards to training. One of them is that we can then go and train, and we did train lots of negotiators who can kick off that negotiation now with some evidence-based things that can go in their simulations, their role plays, their training manual that weren't there before. And for me, that is halfway there, because you can change at least the frame in which people are training. Some of it is harder. Some of these things you're going to forget them, or they just don't come naturally to you because they did somehow come naturally to somebody else. And it's those things that seem to come naturally to people who are very good at their jobs. That's what we want to find, so that we can at least have an evidence base for training, writing manuals and that kind of thing.
When you're looking at a conversation and analysing it, what do you define as a great conversation or a successful conversation?
A successful conversation is one that is frictionless. I've got a nice analogy. I've got an analogy and an example, if that sounds okay. So my analogy is, imagine that you are in a hot air balloon looking down on the landscape, and you're looking at a field, and when you look down, you can see the entry point to the field, and you can also see the exit to the field because you're high up and you can look. And you can also see what the path looks like across the field. You can see that first of all there is a little bit of a hill, and then there's a little bit of a pond, and then there's a tree, and you can kind of see the landscape of that field. So now imagine that you're looking down on the field and you see a dog walker and a dog, and you see them navigate that field together side by side all the way across, navigating each of the tree, the pond, and they get to the other side of the field. And now imagine that you're looking down and you see, not that I'm comparing any humans to dogs, by the way, but imagine that you're looking down now and the dog is everywhere. So the dog's gone into the hedge, and you've got to go turn back and get the dog and then bring them back to the path. And then a bit further along, the dog lingers, and so you're constantly having to sort of bring the dog back to the path. So, but you looking from the hot air balloon, you know where that's going because you see the overall arch of that field. And conversations are a bit like this, whereby in any interaction, when you look at lots of examples of the same kind of encounter, you know what the overall landscape is because you know what the starting point is, you know how the end is, and you know what the main tasks are along the way. So that's the systematic nature of interaction. However, as individuals, we're all idiosyncratic, and so we can take a long time to get from A to B. So for me, a good conversation is one where you get from A to B with the least false starts, having to turn back, explain it again, and you kind of move along it side by side in alignment with the person. So that's my analogy. My example, if you'd like my example, because I think this example again speaks to so many things that we typically don't think about in conversation. So imagine you're in a cafe, and I have these examples are from my field notes, because I often make notes after I've had an encounter because I think they're a great example. So I'm in a cafe, and I've ordered a cup of tea, and the cafe staff give me the tea, and I say thank you, and then I say, oh, do you have Wi-Fi? And they say, yes, we do. And I have to say, oh, so can customers use it? Yes, they can. So do I need a code, or is it open? And they eventually give me the information that will get me to use the Wi-Fi. And in this cafe, the fact is that, there is Wi-Fi for customers, but it's taken 6 turns to get there. And at the end of it, I'm thinking, I'm never coming here again because that was really painful, even though you gave me the information. So, of course, a better way to do it would be, do you have Wi-Fi? Yeah, it's open. And so immediately they understand that, they're listening. So they know that, do you have Wi-Fi isn't just a yes, no question. I don't think that cafe staff member thought that. I thought they were just being a bit obstructive or just not very helpful. But even better is, this is another cafe now, going into the cafe, ordering the tea. And as the tea comes across the counter from the staff member, they say, if you need Wi-Fi, here's the code. And in this instance, I haven't even had to ask. And the conversation is very short. It's in fact, it's like a turn, and I feel great about them. So this is nice because I think it tells you a couple of things that are really important. One of them is that effective conversations can be very short. And that's kind of the opposite of what a lot of people think they need to do to have an effective conversation, which is spend time building rapport and, adding lots of turns into an interaction that aren't really relevant to the conversation, but somehow people feel they need to do that work. So effective conversations are short. They anticipate the needs of the other person and meet them without you having to really push for it.
Can I explore this thing about effective conversation can be short? Because I agree with you, and but also I have this experience that very often an example could be that a leader feels that the leader is going into a conversation where they need to get something across. They have what we call an advocacy. They need an information from my head to your head. It can be very efficient. It can be very short. If the receiver has a somewhat different expectation to the conversation, i.e., I thought we were somehow co-creating something, what can you say a little bit about, because what we've experienced is that if you look at 2 positions in a conversation, one being advocacy, something from my head into yours, and the other side is inquiry in some shape and form, where I'm curious as to what you're thinking, what's in your head, and to get that into mine. Our experience is that when we transcript this, or my experience is when you transcript this in conversations, most conversations are about 90% advocacy from both sides. So there is very little curiosity and very little inquiry into where does this land and what's your reaction. So I'm a little bit, when you say effective, conversations can be very short. Really?
Yeah. I think it's back to listening. So it's back to, are you listening for what it is that this person seems to want from me turn by turn, and being good enough to adapt.
Could you say something about asking great questions? So what is a beautiful question?
A beautiful question is one that there isn't a beautiful question out of context and purpose. And a good question is one that thinks about the recipient and their ability to answer the question, the importance of them answering the question, your entitlement to ask the question. So those are the things that should be shaped. Well, they do shape. We see evidence of people attending to those kinds of things in conversation, and then we also see people not. So again, an example would be, I did some work on customer inquiries, sales kinds of calls where someone they're already a customer, they're phoning. It's not a cold call, it's like a warm call. And so someone is phoning to buy windows and double glazing, the classic sales environment. And before they've even been asked what kind of windows would you like, they're asked, how did you hear about us? And after the how did you hear about us, there's 1.9 seconds of silence, which in my world is huge. And then you get just on Google. So it's a delayed response, and the answer comes, but it's problematic in 2 ways which are important. One of them is it's in the wrong place in the encounter. So the better salespeople ask that question at the end when all of the the other person's business has been done. The other thing is that it's a question with a sense of entitlement in it. And really the customer is not entitled, they're not obliged to tell you where they found out about you. That benefits you. And so that's the kind of thing where you need to think, well, am I entitled to ask this question? Not really. I am entitled to say, what kind of windows would you like? That's different. So a better way to ask the question is something like, just before you go, would you mind telling us how you heard about us? And if you do that after the business has been transacted, at the end of the encounter, at the other side of the field, and you ask it with a less sense of, I'm entitled to ask this and you are obliged to answer, then that is a better question.
What about non-repetitive conversations? What are the insights for me as a leader? I'm in, say, 15 different conversations every day, like that are meetings, and then maybe I have another 100 touch points during that day. So that can be a look in the eye, it could be just exchanging a few words. So I'm a conversationalist in my everyday life. So based on your work, what's your advice to me? That's how I navigate 100 touch points a day.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because, of course, just thinking about that the repetitiveness. Sometimes it's repetitive for one party, but not for the other. So one thing that's kind of interesting when I compare across settings, and I look at something that is very repetitive for one party, but is unique for the other, you then have to think, well, how do they manage it all? And of course, everyone is just using all of their communicative, conversational competencies or not to navigate those encounters and put them together. Let's just say there are building blocks for interactions, and we use different ones with different people in different ways, in different orders, and so on. I think that there's two things which are core all the time. One of them is core to all conversation, and I mentioned it earlier, which is this idea conversation analysts have of recipient design, so that we're always designing what we say for the purpose of the current purpose, which might be a very fleeting interaction. And then it's kind of knowing not to extend it, because you can see that this should be a fleeting interaction and not kind of keeping someone else in it beyond what seems to be and should be a fleeting encounter. So we all know what that feels like, being kind of held in something longer than you're thinking, why am I still here at the supermarket checkout, because this is meant to be a quick one, or something like that. Through to thinking again about how much does someone know. So am I telling somebody something that they already know or should already know? Are they in a position where they can't tell me, you told me this yesterday, or actually I already know that thing because I am an expert, or whatever, So thinking about what the other person knows, thinking about what you're entitled to do and what they're entitled to do, and those sort of mutual obligations and so on. And the other thing which I think is really interesting, and it runs across a lot of different settings that I've studied, is something that me and, again, my colleague Ryan Sickland have called burden, interactional burden. And so one of my examples was from the cafe. So having to really push to get the thing that you were going to get anyway, which is the Wi-Fi code. But I think this idea of burden runs everywhere. So we did some research looking at patients calling their primary care practice. And one of the things that we found time and time again was at the end of the call, that the receptionist the appointment was kind of made. When you look at the transcript, you see that all of the business has been transacted, and the receptionist moves to end the call with all right, so thank you. And then the patient has to push back into the conversation, and what they generally want is confirmation. Before they go, they want to hear, so who am I calling? So who am I seeing? When will the results be there? And what we found was that the surgeries where the receptionist provided the confirmation and the patient didn't have the burden of having to push into that conversation to get the information that they were going to get anyway. So the outcome again is the same. The end of the field is the same. But those surgeries where the receptionist proactively removed those needs for patients to push for things, they did better on then the national, in England we have this national patient survey, and those surgeries did better than the ones where the patients really You could see them straining to get the information, dragging it out of the other person. So I think recipient design and removing interactional burdens are two things that we can put everywhere.
I think recipient design sounds super interesting in this context as well, because I guess one of the things that we're challenging, or we have as a hypothesis, is that sometimes we go into meetings, into these recurrent meetings, just expecting for the landscape of the conversation to look some way. And if we had thought about recipient design, maybe that meeting would have looked differently. So that, I think that's a really interesting concept.
You said if you're always the same, like recipient design. So you're literally saying that I should be careful not to be always the same. I should go in fresh, if you may. I should go in and be able to show up differently every time, and just sense what part of me should hold space for this conversation. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so, because I think it's not it wouldn't be a hugely different thing every time. Sometimes it could be as subtle as changing intonation or how much animation you put into your face or something like that. And we do this already. One would hope that we tend to greet people in different ways. We don't do a double cheek kiss to everybody, you would hope. And we, greetings changed enormously actually during the pandemic. So and again, it's all about that. But the fact is that we also can do this kind of stuff very, very subtly. So to give you an example, not from COVID, but from just because I think this is the kind of thing that we tend not to think about with regards to listening, because we tend to think that all has to be audio. And as a conversation analyst, we're looking always at embodied conduct as well. So I was in a train coming home from Scotland all the way back down south. And it was a really crowded train, even when I got on in Scotland. And then as the train just goes through all the big cities in the north of England, got really full. And at one point, lots of people got on. They'd obviously either been to a football match or were going to a football match. So it was very loud, very rowdy, very crammed, lots of drinking. And I felt very uncomfortable. And I because I'd got on at the start, I was kind of in my seat, just kind of minding my own business. But there was a woman at the other end of the carriage, and we just did this look to each other. It was so, it was infinitesimal. You couldn't have captured it on a video to study it, really. And we looked at each other, and we knew that we were both reading this situation in the same way. And we somehow conveyed with a glance, we'll look out for each other on this train. And that's what human beings can do. It doesn't have to be overt. We do things very powerfully that are very subtle. And I don't think we think enough about that.
But that's a beautiful example of a conversation, that look in the eye. I have a question, or a comment to what you said, this thing about not being the same in conversations. We also know from research that as a human, when you've done the same thing 3 to 4 times, your personal engagement goes down. So it's actually what you're sharing with us here is actually an invitation to be experimenting in your conversations, which, by the way, would fuel your own engagement. So you would be present differently if you were showing up differently.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you say experiment, simply because one of the founders of the broader field within which conversation analysis sits, Harold Garfinkel, he invented something called breaching experiments, whereby you maybe go a bit further than what you're suggesting, and I think he had his students do things like, if someone said, "How you doing?" they'd say, "What do you mean, how am I doing?" And kind of breach the things that are routinely expected. And what that shows is that people very quickly get very uncomfortable because and that shows what the norm is, because the breach is so overt. And I think those "how are you" moments at the start of conversations are very interesting to think about. And I've done a lot of work and thinking about, first of all, busting the myth that those "how are yous" are meaningless and they don't do anything, because in fact they're calibrating, if you're listening, what kind of interaction this is.
if we look at conversations broadly speaking, I'm thinking about in organizations, can you see shifts in what people are longing for in conversations? So I go into a conversation, and is there a kind of a generic longing in us as humans?
I think there probably is. I mean, it's not my field to kind of try to assess that, but what I suppose I can say is that when you record lots of interactions and study them, you can see where all the gaps happen, the repairs happen, the fixes happen, the friction happens.
Where's that?
And so, sorry?
Where is that?
Well, it can be it depends on the organization, but a lot of it is at the start of encounters, where one person is trying to have one kind of interaction and they're not hearing that the other person doesn't want that kind of interaction. And we can get trapped in those sequences really quickly. It's much more difficult than we think, because we know that we can do these things so subtly to show, I have seen that behavior and I understand it in the same way you do, and I am going to intervene. Because if you're in a space where someone is saying something problematic, if one of the barriers to saying something is not being sure that it was something that everybody else felt as well. And that doesn't mean that you need other people's endorsement to act, but if you can immediately see that someone else has seen that same thing, then and you want to say something, it gives you confidence. So you can see all these kinds of things happening interactionally. And so as a leader, being available for a train carriage moment, I think is quite important. And not everyone does that.
I think one of the things that has surprised me about our conversation is how much we've been talking about a form of empathy, of being able to make space to read the person you're in conversation with or the people in the room if you're in a meeting.
And also the granularity of, sensing pauses and paying attention to your own choice of words. All these subtle things that really constitutes the conversation.
None of these things that we've been talking about are sort of scientific in as much as they're not things that are outside of what people already do. So everything that I find, I'm seeing because people are already doing it, and that's quite important. So there's nothing special in some ways. But when we think about someone who's a really good communicator, whatever that might mean, then you can start to pin it down to sometimes these tiny, tiny things, but they're not tiny in a way that is like alien to us, because lots of people do it. It's just kind of showing what it is, and showing it scientifically is important, because we tend to think about much bigger pieces rather than think about each building block is going to change the bigger piece in the end. And I think that's important. And the other thing because you mentioned empathy, I think it's really important to understand that empathy can be very short and pragmatic. You can achieve that sense that you've really understood and helped somebody incredibly quickly. It doesn't have to be, I think we tend to push that into the territory of long, open-ended, elicit everything from the other person kinds of ways. In fact, I think, that cafe staff member who offered me the Wi-Fi code had a deep empathy for what it is that people in the cafe probably wanted.
So I'm taking away recipient design. I'm taking away train carriage moment. That when you told that example, I think I had goosebumps. So that was beautiful. And then the surprise about the empathy. After having had this conversation, what is it that you will take into the next?
I think the train carriage conversation, which was infinitesimally small, tiny, is something that I want to actually think about much more, because I've only really talked about it now with you. And I think it's quite powerful because it says so much with such a tiny, non-verbal, at a distance, hard to capture, but it really lands. So I'm going to think about train carriages.
I'm going to think about making friends with the unknown, being this thing about allowing myself to not always show up the same.
Thank you so much for your time.
It's been a pleasure to talk with you.
Likewise. Thank you, Liz.
If you're interested to follow up on any of the references in this episode, follow the link in the episode description. Thanks for listening. Remember, you're never not in conversation, so stay curious out there. See you next time.